Hi, everybody. Tonight, let us drift gently into the past. Not the sparkling courts of kings or the majestic ramparts of noble castles, but into the smoky, tangled alleys of a world few remember. In this story, we walk not among heroes or troubadours, but beside the humble folk of medieval Europe, bound by toil and hunger, and defined by the strange, often revolting customs of food and feast. Yes, tonight, we begin a quiet, meandering journey through the forgotten truth of why food, so essential, so sacred, was for many quite simply disgusting in medieval Europe. Over 22 parts, each like a gentle turn of a well-worn page, we shall peer into kitchen hearths, wooden bowls, and the flickering lives that gathered hungrily around them. Rest easy, dear listener, for the story is long, the night is patient, and sleep waits just around the corner. Once, in the narrow twilight between the fall of the Roman Empire and the dawn of the Renaissance, Europe found itself in a hush, a quiet that had settled not just over its fields and forests, but over its very kitchens. Imagine the landscape then. Endless tracts of farmland worked by calloused hands, a pale sun low in the sky, and meals that were less celebration and more survival. In the 9th century, a peasant woman named Alice stood barefoot before a squat wooden hut on the edge of what is now Normandy. Her fingers were chapped from the morning's cold, and from the bundle of roots she clutched, parsnips, mostly, knobby and pale, half-rotted at the tips. This was dinner. She stirred them into a blackened iron pot where water barely simmered over a dull fire. No herbs, no salt. The broth would be thin, the taste flat. Her children watched silently from the corner, stomachs shrunken by familiarity with hunger. This was the norm. But why, we must ask? Was it so? Why did the very act of eating, so joyous in other cultures, become in medieval Europe an ordeal of sour, moldy bread, worm-riddled grains, and meats more foul than fresh? Part of the answer lies in preservation, or rather its absence. In a world without refrigeration, time was food's bitterest enemy. Meat was salted until it turned stiff and gray. Fish, when it could be found, was smoked in thick haze, often so heavily that its original flavor vanished beneath soot and brine. Butter curdled quickly. Milk turned in a day. Cheese was a gamble. Sometimes it fermented beautifully, sometimes it crawled with things better left unnamed. Spices, you might ask? A rare treasure. Pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were reserved for the elite, traded across continents at the price of gold. For the commoner, the only seasoning came from ashes that drifted into the pot, or the acrid tang of smoke from green wood. But this was not merely a tale of poverty. Even nobles, with their glittering banquets and endless courses, often served dishes that would turn the modern stomach. A peacock, its feathers reattached after roasting, a pie filled with live birds, sausages that bled when cut. To show extravagance, they turned their meals into spectacles, often at the expense of edibility. And yet, through all this, people lived. They ate, they gave thanks. In the convent of St. Brigid, Sister Anselma prayed before a wooden bowl filled with pottage. It was made from dried peas, boiled until their color had faded to a pale green-gray. A crust of coarse rye bread floated on the surface, so hard it could have dulled a knife. She bowed her head not in complaint, but in gratitude, for it was Lent, and food, however bland, was a blessing not to be scorned. Still, it is worth imagining what these foods smelled like. The ever-present scent of damp straw, the tang of animal fat clinging to everything, the sharp sting of fermented cabbage or ale left too long in the cask. A child once described their village feast as like the inside of a pig's ear after a rain. Yet hunger alters the senses. When the stomach growls loud enough, even the strangest fare becomes welcome. In the Highlands of Scotland, shepherds boiled oatmeal until it became a gray mass, so thick it could be sliced with a blade. In the German forests, women gathered acorns, ground them into flour, and made bitter loaves barely chewable unless soaked in beer. And beer. Beer. It was not merely a drink, but salvation. Brewed weak and warm, it was safer than water, which teemed with sickness. Children drank it. So did monks, who fasted on bread and beer alone during long Lenten days. You may wonder how people endured this daily monotony. But food was not eaten for pleasure. It was consumed for necessity. Meals were brief, unspoken, eaten with fingers or a dull spoon. Only on feast days, or at weddings and funerals, did the cauldron grow fat with meat and marrow. Still, despite all, there were glimmers of humanity. A farmer might hide a sprig of thyme in his boot to flavor the pot unseen. A wife might bury a carrot in the snow to keep it crisp for the baby's toothless gums. And sometimes, if the wind was right and the fire burned low, the stew would taste almost good. Tonight, we end here, in a dim kitchen lit by tallow candles, where a girl stirs her pot slowly, humming a tune passed down by grandmothers who, too, knew the flavor of survival. Let her song drift into your dreams as we pause this quiet tale. When you're ready, we shall walk further into the shadowed kitchens of medieval Europe. The morning mist settled low upon the thatched roofs of a small village nestled deep in the folds of the Loire Valley. A cock crowed faintly in the distance, and smoke began to curl from chimneys, thin and gray. Inside one such cottage, where the stone floor was damp and the walls wept with cold, old Berthe, a widow of 60 years, prepared the morning meal for her grandchildren. The hearth crackled weakly with damp wood, and the iron pot above it steamed with a scent that was more earthy than appetizing. This was porridge, if it could be called that, made from a blend of barley and oats, soaked overnight and stirred until it became something between gruel and glue. Berthe reached for a wedge of last week's bread. Its surface so hardened it could scratch the skin, and she dunked it into the porridge to soften it before handing it to the eldest child. They chewed in silence, teeth grinding slowly, eyes half-lidded with sleep and hunger alike. The food was warm. That was its one kindness. In these early medieval centuries, even basic sustenance came through a ritual of compromise. There was no certainty of the next meal, nor variety to dream of. Bread, the very heart of peasant diet, was often made from rye or barley, coarse and flecked with husks. In times of scarcity, other things were added to stretch the dough: bean flour, mashed roots, or even ground bark from birch trees. When times were truly desperate, bread was darkened with ground straw or chalk. Mold, too, was no stranger. Without preservatives or proper storage, loaves often turned quickly, yet they were eaten still. Greenish blooms were scraped away, the remainder toasted near the fire to disguise its bitterness. In many homes, it was not uncommon to hear a child ask if bread was safe to eat today. The answer was rarely a confident one. And then there was ergot, a fungus that thrived in damp rye fields. Invisible to the eye, it tainted bread with hallucinations, convulsions, and madness. Villages would suffer strange outbreaks where people danced uncontrollably in the streets, their limbs twisted by spasms, eyes wild and unfocused. In hushed tones, they called it St. Anthony's fire, and they blamed spirits or sin. Few suspected their daily bread. In monasteries, where the diet was more disciplined, things were not always better. Monks observed fasts that forbade meat and sometimes even dairy. Meals were taken in silence, and though the portions were more regular, the monotony could be crushing. Lent, in particular, stretched the imagination to its limits. Fish was permitted, but in many parts of Europe, fish meant salted herring or dried stockfish, so leathery it required hours of boiling. Still, monks gave thanks and scraped every last flake from the bone. The nobility, meanwhile, were not immune to the grotesque. At banquets, they dined on grandeur, yet beneath the gilded crusts and perfumed sauces often lay decay. Meat hunted days prior was rarely fresh by the time it reached the table. A boar's head might be reassembled with wax and dye to appear whole, its flesh stewing within, gray and faintly sour. Game birds hung until high, that is, until they reeked, were prized for the richness their decay provided. Rottenness was seen as ripeness. One such evening, at the manor of Lord Theobald of Anjou, a feast was held in honor of his betrothal. The hall was hung with evergreen boughs and animal hides, the tables groaning under platters of glistening meat, gilded pies, and colored jellies. Yet, behind the pageantry, the kitchen told another story. The swan, centerpiece of the meal, had been dressed and redressed after roasting, its wings singed and its skin dried to leather. The head had been replaced with a carved likeness, waxen and expressionless. None remarked on the odd taste. It was not the food that mattered, it was the spectacle. Sauces, thick and dark, often masked what lay beneath. They were made with wine-turned vinegar, breadcrumbs, and the few spices available, mustard seeds, horseradish, or wild herbs gathered from hedgerows. When meat was too far gone, it was boiled with onions until the scent of rot mellowed, then drenched in such sauces. One chronicler, after attending a noble's table, wrote, The flesh was of uncertain origin, but well disguised. And yet, the body was not always fooled. Sickness was frequent. Parasites thrived in undercooked meats, and improper storage led to poisoning. Stomachs bloated painfully, fevers came without warning. In a world where medicine remained chained to humors and bloodletting, recovery was uncertain. Still, people found meaning in their meals. For all its faults, food was a rhythm, a marker of the seasons. Spring brought greens, nettles, leeks, and sorrel. Summer gave berries and wild honey. Autumn, the great harvest, was a brief moment of color and bounty before winter's grip returned. In the candlelight of a low-ceiling kitchen, a mother once shaped dough into tiny figures for her children, birds, stars, and flowers. Though the flour was coarse and the oven an open flame, she made each one with care, a quiet act of beauty amid daily struggle. The children clapped when she brought them out, blackened at the edges and smelling faintly of ash. These moments, rare, fragile, were what gave the medieval world its quiet grace. Beneath the rot, the hardship, the bitter taste of survival, there flickered a small, persistent warmth. The same warmth that we chase even now, when we gather around tables and break bread with those we love. Tonight, let that warmth follow you into your dreams, gentle and unhurried, like the steam rising from an old iron pot on a cold morning. We shall continue this tale when next you're ready to return. In the southern reaches of medieval Spain, where orange groves whispered beneath the sun and stone villages clung to hillsides like ivy, there lived an old apothecary named Mateo. He was a man of quiet habits and long silences, his hands permanently stained by roots and dried tinctures, his breath carrying the faint scent of vinegar and thyme. In his little house, tucked behind a crumbling chapel, he brewed more than remedies. He brewed ideas. And one idea, which had become a quiet obsession, was the mystery of taste. Mateo had once journeyed to Cordoba, where the scent of cumin and saffron clung to the air, and where the Islamic kitchens dazzled with preserved lemons, roasted lamb spiced with coriander, and stews rich with cinnamon and dates. That memory lingered in him like perfume. It haunted him as he returned to his native village, where the daily fare was a thin gruel, with onions so sharp they stung the tongue, and dried beans that cracked between the teeth like gravel. What had happened, he wondered, to the joy of eating? Why did the rest of Europe stew in monotony and rot while the Moorish courts dined on wonders? He kept a notebook, rare and precious, filled with his theories. Poor soil, he wrote, yielded poor crops. Bitter herbs, small grains, worms in the barley. But it was more than that. It was fear. The Christian world feared excess, feared the tongue's pleasure, feared indulgence as a step toward sin. He underlined the word again and again, sin. Indeed, in many monasteries and churches, food was tethered tightly to morality. Gluttony, one of the 7 deadly sins, was a warning written into sermons, songs, and sacred texts. To enjoy food too much was to risk the soul. And so, rather than risk temptation, many embraced blandness as virtue. A meal without pleasure was a meal without peril. This mindset filtered into every tier of society. Parents chastised children who asked for more butter. Priests reminded widows that hunger brought one closer to Christ. Even nobles, though they hosted grand banquets, confessed afterward, as if to wash away the indulgence. Pleasure, in all forms, was shadowed by guilt, and yet the body yearned. It rebelled in dreams. Mateo once treated a boy who had eaten an entire jar of preserved figs in one sitting, trembling as if drunk. Another girl, starved of sweetness, was caught licking tree sap and pretending it was honey. Their eyes had the wide, vacant look of thirst unsatisfied. The problem, too, was seasonal. In the bleak months, December through March, food was not only poor, it was vanishing. Cellars emptied, root vegetables shriveled and softened. What little meat was left hung in rafters, black with smoke and salt. Mold crept into cheeses. Rats crept into grain stores. There was a name for this time, the hunger gap. It was during this time that Mateo saw the worst. A woman brought him a child whose belly was round with starvation. The only food she had left was broth made from boiled nettles and the bones of a cat found frozen beneath a shed. She wept not because of what she had done, but because it had not been enough. And yet, amidst the sorrow, there was resilience. People learned to stretch the inedible into something passable. They fermented turnips in barrels, creating a sour mash that filled the belly, if not the heart. They made soups from cabbage cores and garlic tops, sometimes adding a stone for thickness, soup stone, they called it, half joke, half truth. Others gathered wild mushrooms, risking poison for the chance of warmth. In coastal villages, seaweed was dried and eaten like jerky. In the marshlands, frogs were caught and skinned. In the far north, reindeer milk was churned into sour curds. The ingenuity was endless and desperate. And still, the food was dangerous. Tainted water turned stews into vectors for dysentery. Spoiled meats brought fevers. Grains stored improperly developed a sickness of the gut so violent it left entire families writhing through the night. Mateo noted it all in his journal. He became obsessed with patterns, hoping to one day offer not just cures, but prevention. But who would listen to an old man in a village that had not changed in 100 years? One cold evening, as wind howled through the cracked shutters of his cottage, Mateo brewed a soup of his own making. It contained dried lentils from the coast, a pinch of sage, and a rare treasure, a knob of preserved lemon, carried by a trader months prior. The soup simmered long and slow. The scent filled the room with brightness, a memory of warmth, of life. He poured a bowl, carried it to his neighbor's child, who had been coughing through the frost. The child sniffed it, wide-eyed, and whispered, "It smells like a dream." That night, Mateo wrote a single line in his book. Perhaps the soul does not fear flavor. Perhaps it seeks it, even in the shadows. Across Europe, people like Mateo worked in silence. They experimented, they preserved, they dared. Their names would not be recorded, but their choices shaped the slow evolution of food, away from rot and toward revival. So let us pause here, with the image of an old apothecary ladling soup beneath a flickering candle. Outside, the wind groans. Inside, a child sleeps, full for the first time in days. This, too, is a kind of feast, a quiet rebellion against the tasteless dark. Sleep now, if you can, with the scent of herbs in the air and the warmth of survival on your skin. The tale will wait. Far to the north, where the sea breathed cold upon the stone shores and pine forests stretched like dark brush strokes against a pale sky, there sat a fishing village known simply as Gullstrand. Life there was measured in tides and winds, and the food, much like the weather, was harsh and unforgiving. In the dim hours before dawn, a boy named Eirik helped his father pull a heavy net from the black water. The weight of it bent their backs and bloodied their hands, for what it held was not a bounty of silverfish, but a tangle of kelp and 3 pale eyeless cod, stiff with the bite of winter. Still, it was enough. Enough for the pot, enough for one more day. In places like Gullstrand, where farmland was a distant dream and the soil yielded only moss and lichen, the sea became both pantry and peril. Salted fish, mainly cod and herring, formed the backbone of the local diet. These were gutted, brined, and dried upon great wooden racks that stood like skeletal arms along the coast. The process stripped the flesh of all softness, leaving it leathery and sharp. Children gnawed on dried strips like jerky, their jaws aching with effort. And yet there was method to this preservation. Salt, white, coarse, and precious, was the silent guardian of the medieval pantry. It kept death at bay, slowed rot, and masked the sour notes of decay. But it came at a cost. Salting required vast quantities, and those not near the sea had to buy it dearly from merchants or barons who controlled the rights to salt pans and wells. For many inland folk, salting was a luxury. Smoking was the alternative, though the result was often bitter and soot-laced. In Gullstrand, smokehouses were small and packed, their low roofs dripping with tar and resin. Fish hung in rows, blackening with each passing day. The scent clung to clothes, to hair, to the very skin. Eirik's mother often said, with a smile half-tired, "You can smell a Gullstrander before you see him." And when fish were scarce, the village turned to shellfish, mussels, limpets, and sea snails, scraped from rocks and boiled in seawater. These offered little nourishment, but gave the illusion of fullness. Children slurped them like treasures, though the taste was brackish, and the texture turned many a stomach. Even inland, water-dwelling creatures were common in times of fasting. Monasteries allowed the consumption of fish, even amphibians. Thus, frogs and eels became unexpected staples. In France, eels were stewed with herbs, their slippery forms reduced to tender flesh with enough boiling. In England, jellied eels, though later a delicacy, began as a necessity, a way to store meat without salt or smoke. One winter, the people of Gullstrand found themselves trapped by ice. The sea froze thick, the nets came up empty, and what food remained was scant. Eric's family had only a few sacks of barley meal and a barrel of dried herring. The water they fetched from a nearby stream had frozen solid, and so they melted snow for their porridge. Each morning, the same thin gruel. Each night, the same salted herring, soaked and boiled to soften the brine. But then, something unexpected happened. An old man named Torbjorn, long thought senile and harmless, emerged from his hut carrying a bundle of withered sea kale. He had dug it from beneath a blanket of snow, he claimed, growing near the cliffs. Boiled, it tasted bitter, but it gave warmth to the bones. He shared it freely. "There's more to eat than what the sea gives," he said, eyes glinting with strange wisdom. Soon others followed. A woman found puffballs, fungi the size of fists, growing in a sheltered glade. Another uncovered burdock roots beneath thawing soil. What began as desperation became discovery. And so a feast of sorts was born. Sea kale, puffballs, burdock, and barley porridge thickened with dried herring. A strange, humble stew. It did not taste good, but it kept death from the door. Around the fire, they ate in near silence, but with a reverence that bordered on holy. For many in medieval Europe, food was not measured by flavor, but by the absence of hunger. A meal was good if it filled the belly. That it might offend the tongue was a small price to pay. Still, the memory of better things lingered. Stories passed down of apples sweet as honey, of boar slow roasted over green wood, of cheeses so rich they melted on the tongue. These were dreams, mostly. But sometimes a traveler brought dried fruits from the south, figs, raisins, or dates, wrapped in oiled cloth. These were treated like relics, pressed to the nose and tongue before being divided, morsel by morsel, among an entire family. Eric tasted a fig once, given to him by a passing monk. It was sticky, fragrant, unlike anything he had ever known. For days after, he dreamed of orchards and sun. He never forgot. By spring, the ice had receded, and fish returned to the nets. Life resumed its familiar rhythm. But the people of Gullstrand remembered that bitter stew and the lessons it carried. They began to forage more, to dry leaves and roots for future winters. They did not become rich. They did not feast, but they endured. So let us leave Gullstrand now, where the waves once again lap soft upon the rocks and smoke drifts gently from a dozen huts. Eric sleeps, his hands still smelling of fish, but his dreams sweeter than his meal. He has tasted survival and something just beyond it, hope. When the night deepens and sleep calls, may you too feel that quiet resilience. We shall return soon, with more to share. In the heartland of the Holy Roman Empire, nestled between dark woodlands and fog-laced rivers, there was a modest market town called Erlenbruck. It was neither grand nor poor, but quietly endured the changing tides of the medieval centuries. Life there moved in rhythms, church bells, seasons, and the rustle of carts over cobbled roads. And every seventh day, beneath the stone tower of St. Leonhardt's Chapel, the townsfolk gathered, not for prayer, but for bread. Bread, in Erlenbruck, was not merely sustenance. It was ritual. It was the anchor of life, the divider of days. But it was also a source of constant trouble, for bread in the medieval town was a thing precarious, inconsistent, and at times dangerously foul. On a morning in early spring, the baker's boy Otto rose before the sun. He stoked the great stone oven with pine kindling, then began to prepare the dough, coarse rye flour mixed with tepid water, a pinch of sour leaven from the previous day's batch, and a scattering of bran. White flour was unknown to him. Only the nobility tasted such lightness. For the people of Erlenbruck, bread was black, dense, and sour. Otto's hands moved swiftly, practiced by years of repetition. Yet even he could not control the flaws in the flour. The grain, stored in damp silos through the winter, had turned musty. Small insects, weevils mostly, had hatched inside the sacks. They were sifted out when possible, but some remained, crushed into the dough, invisible and inevitable. Still, the loaves would rise, not in beauty, but in necessity. Shaped by hand, scored with a dull blade, and laid on the oven's hot stones, the bread baked slowly as the town awoke. By midday, the air around the bakery carried the thick, sour scent of yeast and char. People queued with linen sacks and copper coins, each one desperate to secure their daily portion. But not all bread was equal. In Erlenbruck, and in much of Europe, the local authorities set strict regulations, known as the assize of bread, to control the weight and price of each loaf. Bakers were watched closely, and any deviation could result in public punishment. Still, corners were cut. Flour was stretched with chalk, ground bones, even dried peas. Bread was at times more stone than seed. Worse still was the specter of ergot. Again and again, it appeared like a curse. In wet years, the rye would darken with strange black filaments. The infected grain, ground into flour, carried a terrible poison. Those who ate it suffered burning limbs, hallucinations, or madness. In Erlenbruck, the people called it Hexenbrot, witch's bread. Otto had seen it once when he was younger. A child from the weaver's quarter, after eating a tainted loaf, ran through the streets shrieking of fire beneath her skin. Her hands curled like claws. She died days later, her mother swearing the devil had come in through the oven. Such fears were common. Bread, the holy food, the gift of God, could turn suddenly into a vessel of torment. And yet, people continued to eat. What else could they do? But bread was not always a terror. Sometimes, when the harvest was good and the flour dry, the loaves came out crisp at the edges, moist within. On feast days, especially Easter and Christmas, the bakers would add honey or egg to a batch, forming sweet, braided loaves sold for a few extra coins. These were luxuries, bought by the wealthier merchants and shared sparingly among kin. At times, the lord of the manor would commission alms bread to be distributed to the poor after Mass. These were small rolls, lighter in color, blessed by the priest and handed out by squires. Otto always thought these the best of all, not because of taste, but because they were free of deceit. Made clean and with care, because to poison the alms was to sin doubly. In the poorer quarters, people often baked their own loaves. Communal ovens, great domes of stone, stood at crossroads, and each family had a day or hour when they were allowed to use it. Bread marked the life of a household. When a child was born, a loaf was baked and wrapped in linen. When someone died, a soul bread was given to mourners. When love was declared, it was over crust and crumb. There was a legend in Erlenbruck of a girl named Goethe who once baked a perfect loaf, a round of golden brown, light within, sweetened with apple slices and a touch of cinnamon. It was said she offered it to a wandering friar, who blessed her with a long and happy life. Whether the tale was true or not, young girls tried to replicate the loaf each year at harvest, hoping their bread might bring fortune. By the end of the day, Otto swept the ashes from the oven, hands blistered, eyelids heavy. The last loaf had gone to an old widow who could pay only in onions and thanks. He had accepted without complaint. That night, he ate a crust that had split in baking, dipped in broth, and felt, for a brief moment, full. So ends another day in Erlenbruck, where bread ruled over tables and fate alike. A humble food, shaped by humble hands, capable of both blessing and harm. As sleep folds gently around us, let us imagine the scent of that last loaf cooling on a wooden board, the silence of the empty bakery, and the slow dimming of candlelight. Tomorrow may bring hunger again, but for tonight, the oven rests. And so should we, southward, where the land softened into rolling hills, and the air bore the fragrance of lavender and crushed thyme. There lay a humble estate in the outskirts of Avignon. It was not a grand chateau, but a modest manor surrounded by patches of farmland, vineyards, and a walled herb garden where the cook, Madame Isabeau, spent her quiet hours tending to withered stems and stubborn roots. Madame Isabeau had been born the daughter of a tanner, raised among the thick stench of hides and brine. But through fortune and diligence, she found herself apprenticed to a noble household's kitchen, and over the years rose to her own small place of command. Though her tools were crude and her pantry sparse, she held the secrets of flavor with the reverence of a priest guarding relics. Yet even she could not always mask the truth of what passed for food. On this particular day, as spring leaned toward summer, a fresh pig had been slaughtered, an event both grim and anticipated. The entire household paused for it. Every part of the animal would be used. The blood had already been caught in a wide copper basin to be stirred with barley and onions for black pudding. The liver was quickly spiced and seared. The trotters and ears boiled for a gelatinous stew, while the intestines soaked in salt water, destined to become sausages. Sausages in medieval Europe were a study in contrast. They could be rich and savory, stuffed with minced meat, spices, and herbs, or they could be an ordeal, packed with scraps, fillers, and bone fragments too small to see. They were preserved by hanging in smoke, or by drowning in lard. Some turned foul in days. Others fermented into delicacies. Madame Isabeau's sausage was famed for its balance, a mix of garlic, wild marjoram, pork fat, and cracked pepper. The pepper was precious, smuggled from the southern ports, purchased in pinches. She kept it in a small pouch hidden in her bodice, used only in whispers. But not all cooks were so careful. In taverns along the Rhone, sausages were served that hissed and popped with dubious fillings. A traveler once bit into one only to find a fragment of tooth, likely from another creature. Still they ate. Hunger was a sharper fear than revulsion. And then there was cheese, an ever-present companion in the medieval kitchen. Madame Isabeau made her own from sheep's milk, curdled with vinegar, and left to age on wooden slats. In the warmer months, flies gathered, mold spread. Some cheeses grew so sharp they stung the tongue. Others turned soft, almost runny, cloaked in rinds the color of storm clouds. Cheese was unpredictable and yet treasured. It could be stored through lean seasons. It added weight to bread and depth to stews. But when it went wrong, when maggots wriggled through its heart, or it soured beyond remedy, it was still, more often than not, eaten. The noble family Madame Isabeau served rarely questioned what they were fed. Meals were taken in a grand hall, beneath a wooden beam ceiling and flickering candlelight. Platters were passed, and fingers dipped directly into shared bowls. There were no forks, only knives and spoons, and food was often conveyed from hand to mouth without pretense. Sauces were the pride of the house. They disguised the odd tang of spoiled meat and elevated even the plainest grains. Isabeau's red wine reduction with parsley and vinegar was a favorite, as was her garlic and almond blend, thickened with breadcrumbs into a coarse paste. Still, the smells of the kitchen betrayed everything. A slightly sour stench when the veal had sat too long, the faint aroma of musty grain when the flour sack had drawn moisture. She fought a daily battle with rot. And in summer, that battle grew fierce. Insects bred in the corners of the pantry. Milk curdled before midday. The meat sweated, and the vegetables, picked fresh in the morning, drooped and dulled by evening. Pot herbs, sage, savory, rosemary, were hung to dry in the rafters, and used not just for flavor, but for their antiseptic properties. She rubbed thyme on the cutting boards, salt on the table legs, vinegar in the air. One evening, a dish of stuffed pigeon was served at the manor, a rare delicacy. But something had gone amiss. The meat was turned slightly green beneath the wing. The youngest daughter, pale and quiet, fell ill by dawn. Madame Isabeau did not sleep that night. She walked the length of her kitchen again and again, sniffing, tasting, testing. The girl recovered, but trust had been shaken. From then on, she added stronger vinegar to every marinade, seared meat longer, dried her herbs more thoroughly. And still, the line between feast and danger was perilously thin. But there were moments, brief, golden, when the food was good, when the pears from the orchard were sweet and firm, and she poached them in wine with cloves and a splash of rose water, when the stew had simmered all day, thickened with barley and marrow, and even the servants paused to savor its scent, when the bread emerged from the oven crusted and dark, and the cheese, for once, was perfect. In those moments, food became what it was always meant to be, not a struggle, not a mask for rot, but a comfort, a blessing. As night closed around the quiet manor, and Madame Isabeau washed her hands in lavender water, she allowed herself a sip of cider and a moment by the fire. The kitchen was silent, save for the soft crackle of embers and the slow drip of cooling fat. Tomorrow would bring new trials. But for tonight, the oven had cooled, the knives were clean, and the air smelled for once of nothing foul. So let that be the end of today's chapter. Let us rest in the fading warmth of the kitchen hearth and dream of cloves, of pears, of the hush that follows a well-fed evening. We will return to the world of uncertain meals and steadfast cooks when the night calls again. In the swaying valleys of Bohemia, where the rivers ran slow and green beneath the weight of summer reeds, there stood a monastery cloistered among limestone hills. Its bell tolled each hour like a heartbeat in stone, echoing across the farmlands below. Within its quiet walls lived Brother Lucas, a monk of quiet manner and gentle eyes, whose days were governed not by hunger, but by ritual. Brother Lucas tended the monastery's herbarium, a small garden of uneven rows and hand-lettered markers, where sage and rue jostled with wormwood and violets curled in the shade of elder trees. He believed in the power of plants, not just for healing, but for flavor, for memory, for light in the darkest months. Yet even Brother Lucas could not always soften the grim fare served in the refectory. Monastic food, though consistent, was often devoid of joy. It was a diet built not on satisfaction, but on discipline and denial. Monks fasted frequently. On certain days, they abstained from meat, dairy, and even eggs. Lent was the longest stretch of such austerity, but smaller fasts punctuated the calendar: Wednesdays, Fridays, and feast eves. The meals were simple: boiled legumes, dark bread, onions, sometimes dried fruits. Cheese, when allowed, was sharp and crumbling. Butter was rare. Fish was permitted, but fresh catches were a luxury reserved for monasteries near rivers or lakes. Inland, salted herring and dried stockfish were the norm. So hard they required hammering before cooking. Brother Lucas often soaked dried beans overnight, then simmered them with garlic and leeks. The pot he used was scorched at the base, the flavor always tinged with ash. Yet it was filling, and in the cold stone halls of the cloister, warmth mattered more than delight. Once, he had tried to add dried mint to the lentils. The result had been praised in silence, with a few extra spoonfuls taken. But another monk, older and sterner, reported it as an act of indulgence. Brother Lucas was made to recite a psalm of temperance and to fast alone for a day. There was no anger in him, only understanding. In the rule of St. Benedict, pleasure was suspect. Even nourishment was to be weighed against the soul's journey. Eating too well was eating too much. Gluttony was not just the amount taken, but the joy found in it. Yet paradoxically, monks often ate better than the peasants beyond their walls. The monastery controlled farmland, mills, and storehouses. Donations of grain, eggs, and meat flowed steadily from surrounding villages. These gifts were rarely seen in the daily meals of the cloister, but were stored, traded, or prepared for feast days when visiting clergy arrived. On the Feast of St. John, Brother Lucas prepared a meal for the abbot and his guests: poached carp with parsley, stewed apples, and almond custard thickened with oat flour. It was a rare indulgence, and he crafted it with care, using every herb he had dried in the summer sun. But afterward, he returned to his usual bowl of pottage without bitterness. For him, flavor was not a rite, but a kind of grace, given rarely, and only when the heart was still. In the scriptorium, where he spent his afternoons copying ancient recipes and herbal remedies, he often mused on how food touched all lives differently. The peasants outside the walls fought for it, sweated for it. The nobles shaped it into symbols. The monks, perhaps, sought to transcend it. And yet all were bound to it. There was, in one of his old manuscripts, a line he favored above all: "The soul must fast, but the body must be fed, lest both wither." On stormy nights, when the wind howled through the cloister like a lost pilgrim, Brother Lucas would sometimes sneak into the kitchen with a candle. There, he would heat milk, rare and precious, with a sliver of honey and a sprig of lavender. He would sip it slowly, eyes closed, sitting on the cool flagstone floor, not in defiance, but in quiet reverence for the small comfort it gave. Outside, the peasants might be eating coarse bread soaked in beer or roots boiled in muddy water. The monks within had their own bitterness, less visible perhaps, but deeply felt. Food was a mirror. It revealed what one feared, what one loved, what one was allowed. As dawn approached and the bells called once more, Brother Lucas would wash his bowl, replace the spoon, and return to his bed beneath the narrow window. Sleep came easily. The taste of honey lingered on his tongue, a reminder that even in a world of denial, sweetness could be found. So let us sleep now too, with thoughts of mint, of lavender, of hands that plant not for plenty, but for peace. The monastery fades into silence once more, and with it, the soft echo of a monk's gentle hunger. We shall walk with him again when the bells call us back. Beyond the great forests of the east, where wolves howled in moonlit glades, and winters fell with a silence that buried roads and memory alike, there lay a cluster of settlements known only to those who lived among them. The people there spoke in hushed tones, worked in thick wool and hide, and ate whatever the harsh land allowed. Among them was a woman called Dobrava, a widow of quiet strength, known for her skill in making soup from nearly nothing. Dobrava lived on the edge of her village, in a hut roofed with turf and stitched with birch bark. Her pantry was a wooden chest, her cellar a pit dug into frozen ground. There was no marketplace here, no regular trade. The soil was rocky, and only the hardiest crops survived: turnips, barley, garlic, cabbages. For fruit, there were sour plums in summer, and in leaner times, dried apples, tough as leather. In the long months when snow drifted higher than the windows, food became more memory than reality. That was when the dried stores were counted like relics: 2 jars of pickled beets, a sack of cracked rye, some smoked fish wrapped in bark. What remained of the autumn's lard was hard as stone. One morning, Dubrava rose before the sky had shed its darkness. Her breath clouded in the air. She opened the hearth and coaxed life from yesterday's embers. A pot of water was hung, and into it she placed what she had: a split onion, a dried mushroom, a handful of rye, and a bone, picked clean but soaked many times to coax the last of its strength. This was krupnik, a broth of the people. Each pot was different, shaped by what little one had. In some homes, a spoonful of fermented cabbage would be added, lending a sourness that cut through the cold. In others, dried wild herbs, juniper, nettle, lovage, would transform the gray water into something almost fragrant. But even these humble stews could go wrong. Mold crept easily into the dried stores, especially in the damp transitions between winter and spring. A single spoiled onion could sour the whole pot. In these parts, botulism was known, not by name, but by fear. Soup that makes you sleep too long, the elders called it. And so, great care was taken. Dubrava inspected each ingredient with her failing eyes, sniffed, scraped, and tested. When she was certain, she let it boil. By midday, the hut smelled faintly of earth and smoke, and she ladled the thin broth into a clay bowl for her grandson, a small boy with sunken cheeks and wide, patient eyes. He drank slowly, not because he disliked it, but because he knew it must last. Such was the lesson of these remote lives. Every mouthful mattered. There were no feasts here, not in the way we imagine. A feast in Dubrava's village meant a loaf of bread made with lard and eggs, or a chunk of salted pork saved for a saint's day. It meant honey, rarely seen, dripping onto a slab of rye. These moments came once, maybe twice a year. To preserve anything was an act of art. Fish were smoked over green pine, giving them a resinous bite. Meat was buried in snow or packed in sour brine. Mushrooms were strung in long garlands and hung from the rafters, swaying gently in the draft. Sometimes Dubrava would boil milk until it thickened, then pour it into wooden molds and leave it by the stove. The result was a grainy cheese, sour but filling, which she wrapped in nettle leaves to keep the flies away. But the true jewel of her cupboard was a jar of kvass, fermented rye drink, cloudy and brown. It was both food and medicine, used to flavor stews or sip with stale bread. Even children drank it, for water, though clear, was never truly clean. In the village, when someone fell ill, they were given garlic boiled in milk. For fever, horseradish and honey. For cough, boiled lard with pine resin. None of it tasted kind, but it was food in its purest form, meant to heal, to endure. On the night of the spring thaw, the villagers gathered around a great fire. Each family brought what they could: a smoked sausage, a bowl of stewed beans, a crust of honeyed bread. Dubrava brought her soup, thicker this time, with dried mushrooms and a single sliver of pork belly. She poured it into shared bowls, and for once the air rang with laughter. That evening, as snow turned to slush and birds called faintly from the woods, the people of the forest ate without fear. Their meals were not pretty, they were not sweet, but they were honest, and they were theirs. When Dubrava returned home, she sat by the dying fire, wrapped in wool, her hands smelling of broth and birch. She did not speak. She simply listened to the soft drip of melting ice, to the creak of wood in the walls, to the echo of a shared meal still warm in memory. And so we leave her there, in a hut at the end of the world, where soup simmers endlessly and each spoonful is a prayer. Let that warmth carry you now through the quiet hours, and we shall meet again, deeper in the tale. Along the winding lanes of Kent, where the hedgerows grew thick with elderflower and the air held the soft scent of damp hay, there once lived a miller named Haman. His cottage stood beside a watermill that turned day and night, its slow creak like the breathing of an ancient beast. To passers-by, it was a peaceful scene: a stream, a wheel, and a man with flour on his sleeves. But behind the rhythmic clatter of grinding stones lay a truth well known across England. Not all bread was born equal, and not all millers were to be trusted. Haman was honest, or at least more so than most. His grain was weighed fairly, and his toll, The small portion he took from every sack brought by the villagers was not more than what custom allowed. But even he could not protect the flour from what the seasons did to it. Mold grew in damp grain. Rats chewed through sacks. Sometimes the barley sprouted before it could be milled, and the flour, though pale, bore the strange scent of rot. He sifted it as best he could. His wife, Annis, helped in the evenings, her fingers red and raw from the chill. Together, they baked coarse loaves that were dark and sour, their crusts thick, their insides dense. On good days, the bread rose high and cracked at the top. On bad days, it sagged like wet linen and smelled faintly of mildew. Still, the people bought it. They had no choice. In the village, bread was a staple so essential that its absence stirred panic. When harvests failed, as they often did due to wet summers or early frosts, the price of grain climbed steeply. Bakers used more filler to stretch their dough. Ground beans, chalk, old bread dried and crushed. A dishonest baker might add lime or clay. The result? Loaves that looked fair but sat like stone in the gut. The villagers had names for such abominations: windloaf, grit bread, the deceiver. It was said that one could tell the worth of a town not by its church but by its bread. Kent, being fertile, fared better than many, but even here, hunger came in waves. One winter, when the Thames froze and the fields were blanketed in silence, a strange illness spread. It began with cramps, then spasms, then a terrible burning in the limbs. Whole families fell ill. At first, they blamed the wind, or perhaps the mists that lingered too long. But Haman, cautious and methodical, began to suspect the rye. He traced the grain back to a storehouse near the marshes. It had been damp when harvested, and the kernels were streaked with dark purple sclerotia, ergot, invisible once ground into flour but deadly in the mouth. The villagers had eaten it for weeks. The priest called for prayer. The healer mixed thistle and vinegar. Haman burned the remaining sacks, though it pained him to waste. Slowly, the sickness waned, but the memory remained. After that, trust in bread faltered. People turned to porridge, to peas, to roots, and boiled acorns. Bread became a luxury again, something watched, weighed, tested. Haman began growing his own barley, smaller in yield but safer. His loaves became heavier, but the village accepted them. In their cottage, Annis learned to flavor the dough with fennel and caraway when they could afford it. Once she made a barley cake with honey and dried apples, a treat for the feast of St. Martin. It was shared among 20 souls, each receiving a sliver no thicker than a knife's blade. But they remembered it for months. Their daughter, Meg, played beside the sacks of grain, her hands dusted with flour. She asked once why bread was always brown, never white like the drawings in the church. Haman smiled sadly and said, "Because we live near the soil, not above it." White bread was for the nobility. It was sieved again and again, made from wheat grown in drier, richer soils. In castles, it was served with meat and cheese, and used as trenchers, plates made of soft bread that soaked up the juices and were then discarded or given to the poor. But in places like Kent, the bread itself was the meal. It was boiled in broth, fried in dripping, crumbled into milk. Nothing was wasted. There were festivals, of course, times when food broke free from its dullness. Harvest suppers with onion tarts, mashed turnips, and flat cakes cooked over stone. May Day feasts with cheese curds and early greens. On such days, the air was filled with music, the laughter of children, and the rare scent of baking sweetened with fruit or treacle. But they were fleeting as warmth in winter. On his final day, many years later, Haman rose early and turned the mill one last time. The water wheel creaked, the grain poured, the flour danced in sunlight through a broken shutter. He passed quietly that evening, a crust of bread beside his bed, and a linen pouch of grain left by his daughter at the hearth. The village buried him with a piece of barley loaf in his hands, so that he would not go hungry in the next world. And so we leave Kent behind, where bread is both burden and blessing, where millstones turn endlessly like time itself. Sleep now, to the soft sound of grinding grain and the smell of loaves rising in the night. The tale will carry on, as gently as a wheel in water, high in the Carpathian mountains, where mist clung to the trees and the sky often seemed no more than a veil of cloud. The village of Bargan rested like a secret. It was a place of narrow paths, sloping roofs, and silence, a silence broken only by the cry of crows or the lowing of cattle on frost-bitten mornings. Here, amid rock and shadow, food was less a pleasure and more a pact with the land. Old Petra, a woman bent with time and hardened by the cold, was keeper of the village oven. Built into the side of a moss-covered hill, the oven was a thing of legend, rounded like a beehive, its mouth blackened from centuries of flame. Once a week, the villagers came with dough wrapped in linen, clay pots of millet, or trays of wild root pies to bake. Petra tended the fire, judged the coals, and knew by scent when something had begun to burn. In the mountains, food was never taken for granted. Soil here was thin and summers short. People lived on what they could grow, trade, or trap. The diet was monotonous. Root vegetables, goat cheese, cornmeal, beans. Meat, when it came, was lean and dry, usually smoked to last through the endless months of ice. One of the village staples was mamaliga, a thick porridge made from yellow maize flour. Though maize was a relatively new arrival to these lands, brought from distant coasts, it had taken root quickly. Cheap, filling, and adaptable, it replaced many of the ancient grains that once formed the heart of the mountain meal. Petra cooked hers with salt and a touch of sour cream, served with pickled cabbage and a sliver of sheep's cheese. It was humble food, but it sat warm in the belly. Still, it could not be eaten forever without longing. Children sometimes stared wistfully at the forest's edge, where wild berries and mushrooms promised brief escape from sameness. In autumn, whole families roamed the woods, searching for chanterelles, porcini, and black trumpet mushrooms. These were cleaned carefully, sliced thin, and dried on nets strung above the hearth. Their scent lingered through the winter, a ghost of summer, a whisper of earth. Yet mushrooms were a gamble. Mistaken identity was deadly. One wrong cap, and the stew became a coffin. Every family had stories. A cousin who died, an old woman who forgot her eyesight, a boy who stumbled and laughed before falling cold. Petra herself had buried a sister for such a mistake. So caution ruled the kitchen. Preservation, too, was vital. In dark root cellars dug beneath the stone homes, rows of pickled vegetables lined the shelves. Carrots, turnips, cucumbers, and garlic, all steeped in sour brine spiced with dill and juniper. Meat hung in strips from rafters, cured in salt and smoke until it no longer resembled flesh. Fruit, when gathered, was turned into dulciaza, a thick preserve made by boiling berries in honey or must. Jars were stored like treasure, opened only on feast days or for honored guests. During the dead of winter, when the passes closed and snow buried the roofs, Petra made a soup called ciorba. Its recipe was simple: onion, garlic, sour whey, and whatever else could be spared. Sometimes a marrow bone, sometimes wilted greens. The secret was in the balance: the sourness that awakened a tired tongue, the warmth that eased stiff joints. She served it with stale bread fried in lard and rubbed with garlic, and always a blessing whispered under her breath. The villagers respected her for this. She was no healer, but they brought her gifts when illness came: dried chamomile, pine resin, dried mint. Her remedies were not elaborate. A slice of bread soaked in warm milk for the feverish, burned onion to place near the nose, vinegar rubbed on cold limbs. The cures were crude, but born of understanding. In spring, the snow melted, but the land gave little at first. Hunger remained. It was a time known locally as fomia verde, the green hunger, a cruel irony when the earth began to bloom but little was yet edible. People grew sick from eating too many wild greens, sorrel, nettles, dandelion, boiled again and again to leach bitterness, but still hard on empty stomachs. Petra warned against haste. Even the land needs time to remember, she would say, as she stirred her pot and waited for the young leaves to grow sweet. And slowly, the world warmed. The sheep birthed lambs. The bees stirred. The pickled stores ran dry, but the first radishes came up crimson and sharp. Petra baked a bread with goat cheese and young herbs, wrapped it in cabbage leaves, and gave a piece to every child who had gone the winter without complaint. On that day, smoke rose again from the oven, and laughter echoed from stone walls. As night settled over Bargain and the stars pierced the heavy dark, Petra sat beside her fire, a bowl of hot broth cradled in her hands. She listened to the crackle of pine logs, the slow breathing of her dog by the door, and the distant call of an owl across the hills. No feast, no grandeur, but enough. And in this stillness, in this hush, there is a kind of fullness. Let that fullness settle gently over you now, as the mountain winds fade and the fire dims to embers. We will return again, deeper into the hunger and heart of another place when the hour calls. In the low marshlands of Flanders, where the water crept silently through reeds and the fog rarely lifted before midday, there lived a tanner's apprentice named Willem. His world was one of cold stone, damp air, and the ever-present stench of hides soaking in lime and urine. Yet in the narrow space behind his master's workshop, where a crooked fence half-heartedly enclosed a patch of bare soil, Willem kept a small wooden crate filled with earth. There, against all odds, he grew onions. They were not the fat, sweet onions sung of in taverns or grown in royal gardens. These were sharp, white bulbs that stung the eyes and burned the tongue when eaten raw. But they were his, and more importantly, they were edible. In Flanders, food came with difficulty. The land was fertile but fickle. Crops drowned as easily as they grew. Floods from the North Sea, unexpected and cruel, salted the soil and left the people begging for grain from the inland towns. Even when the weather was kind, the harvest was often commandeered by lords, abbeys, or passing armies. What remained was precious and carefully measured. Willem's diet was like many others of his class, a slow rotation of boiled legumes, barley bread, cabbage, and when fortune smiled, a strip of cured pork or a smear of goose fat on crust. Meat was rare, and when it appeared, it came with suspicion. Offal was common: liver, kidneys, stomach, even lungs. These were boiled or fried with onions, heavily salted, and shared across households. He had once watched his neighbor prepare a feast of sheep's head stew. The skull had been split and simmered with leeks and stale ale. The eyes were plucked and given to the children as a treat. The brain was mashed with vinegar and spread on rye. It was grim to watch, but the smell was, oddly, inviting. Salted fish, especially herring, was the true meat of the poor. Willem often ate it with porridge or bread soaked in thin ale. It was stringy, sometimes rotten, but filled the stomach. His mother used to press the fish into a ceramic pot with mustard seeds and thin slices of apple to disguise the foulness. Now he ate it plain, standing in the doorway of the tannery, his fingers oily and blackened from work. Market days offered brief glimpses of color. Traders came with carts of dried beans, hard cheeses wrapped in wax, onions bundled with twine, and the occasional basket of bruised fruit. Apples, usually small, tart, often half-rotten. Willem saved up for them. Once he bought a plum so soft it burst in his mouth. He still remembered the sweetness, sharp and sudden, like a forgotten song. But such pleasures were rare. More often, the stalls sold the scraps: pig's feet, barley hulls, wormy chestnuts. And in winter, even those vanished. Hunger did not come as a storm, but as a slow, creeping mist. It dulled the limbs, hollowed the face, made even the foulest morsel seem precious. When famine struck, as it did in the years when rains failed or war passed through, people ate bark boiled into paste or dough made from powdered acorns. They chewed leather softened in water. Rats grew scarce. Dogs disappeared. In such times, Willem's onions, sharp and stunted as they were, became priceless. One particularly lean winter, he traded 3 onions for a strip of dried venison. It was hard as wood and tasted of smoke and blood, but he ate it slowly over 3 days, savoring each thread as if it were the finest cut from a nobleman's table. There was a girl named Lieve who worked in the weaver's shed beside the dyer's house. She had red hair always tucked under a kerchief and fingers blue from indigo. One evening, Willem brought her half a boiled onion wrapped in a cabbage leaf. She laughed, kissed him on the cheek, and said, "I've never tasted anything so bitter." But she ate it. When Lieve fell ill weeks later, consumed by fever and a terrible cough, there was little to offer. No doctor would come for a weaver's daughter. Willem made her a broth of garlic, barley, and the last of his onions. He fed it to her by spoon in the candlelight, praying to saints whose names he only half remembered. She recovered, weak but smiling. That spring, he planted more onions. By now, his crate had grown to 3. He added turnips, mustard greens, and a single clump of sorrel. The soil was poor, but he mixed it with ash and compost from the tannery. It was filthy work, but he didn't mind. For the first time in years, he looked forward to the harvest. When he brought a small pot of stewed turnip greens to Lieve's door that summer, her father accepted it without a word and nodded once. Approval enough. And so life continued in Flanders, wet, hard, bitter on the tongue. But between the tannery's stink and the market's clamor, something fragile grew. Flavor, yes, but also love, patience, and a quiet pride. Willem never left his village. He never saw the inside of a castle or dined at a banquet, but he fed those he loved, and he fed himself with dignity. Let us rest now in that narrow lane where onions bloom in wooden crates and where even bitterness can warm the heart. Tomorrow holds more hunger, more struggle. But tonight, there is a bowl of broth, a girl who laughs, and a boy who plants. And that is enough. Read in a soft, slow, sleep-inducing tone. It was in the dim-lit corners of the monasteries that Brother Owain found himself quietly captivated by the art of herbals and preservation. Unlike the loud boasts of the castle kitchens or the earthy chatter of village hearths, the monastic gardens kept their own sort of silence, a holy hush, broken only by the rustle of cloaks and the snip of pruning shears. But even in this sanctuary of structured contemplation, the monks faced the same trials that plagued the rest of Europe: how to make their food not only edible, but sustaining in spirit and health. The gardens bloomed with purpose: marjoram, hyssop, and rue, tucked between beans and hardy greens. But the knowledge of what to eat, what to avoid, and how to prepare it was far from simple. The rule of St. Benedict emphasized moderation, fasting, and the rejection of indulgence. Meals were simple affairs, often broths with stale bread, lentils when they were lucky, and cheese, thick with rind, when the cellars allowed. In such a place, even the concept of taste was suspect. Flavor was temptation, and temptation led the soul astray. Brother Owain, however, was drawn to the texts stored in the cool scriptoria, where vellum pages whispered of ancient Roman fermentations and Eastern spices, long lost to local mouths. He copied recipes with delicate quill strokes, puzzled over half-faded lists of picklings and powders, and occasionally dared an experiment in the cloister's corner hearth. Once, he attempted to steep dried rosemary in warmed vinegar for a medicinal tonic, but the acrid scent sent the prior coughing for hours. Another time, he dried rose petals between sheets of sheepskin, pressing their oils into crude cakes of what might one day be perfume, or might simply be fragrant kindling. Yet, for all his care, the challenge remained. Food turned quickly in the damp cloisters, and what could not be consumed fresh needed to be salted, dried, or brined beyond recognition. A fish, caught one morning and consumed that evening, might be sweet and tender, but that same fish, laid in coarse salt and sealed in a stone crock for winter's depths, emerged months later, smelling of rot, its texture closer to leather than flesh. But it was food, and food, even bad food, was sacred. Meanwhile, outside the monastery walls, peasants fared no better. They too turned to pickling and preserving, not from scientific curiosity, but from pure necessity. Cabbages were fermented into sauerkraut, sometimes spiced with caraway or juniper if the season had been kind. Apples, when abundant, were buried in straw or kept in cool corners to last as long as their skins held. But all these methods shared one central flaw: unpredictability. One year's brine might yield crisp, sour pickles. The next, a mushy mass that stank of sulfur. The problem lay not only in technique, but in ingredients: unrefined salt, inconsistent vinegar, and no means of precise measurement. In some villages, the old women knew tricks handed down through generations: stir counterclockwise when preserving eggs, or speak no curses near the cheesecloth. But even such folk wisdom could not always outpace the creeping fingers of spoilage. The most common danger, however, came not from the spoilage itself, but from what it hid. The ergot fungus, creeping into rye fields in damp seasons, left no visible mark upon the coarse black bread, but it brought convulsions, hallucinations, and madness. St. Anthony's fire, they called it, when the limbs began to burn and tremble, and the soul seemed to flee the body altogether. It was the food that cursed them, the villagers whispered, not their sins. But the priests knew better, or so they claimed. In noble houses, the illusion of safety was maintained with heavier hands. Meat that had soured was bathed in wine or beer, or buried beneath sauces thick with ginger, saffron, or long pepper. The wealthier the household, the more elaborate the disguises. A venison roast that stank of age could be boiled in vinegar, then spiced so heavily it scorched the tongue and numbed the nose. But what mattered was not taste, it was spectacle. If the dish could be carved with ceremony, if it appeared majestic on the platter, it had done its duty. And yet, even here, in the candlelit banqueting halls, guests fell ill. There were whispers of undercooked pheasant causing tremors, of eel pies that led to fevered sleep. But no one dared blame the cooks directly. Instead, the blame was passed to the humors of the body, to imbalanced bile or excess phlegm. Sometimes it was blamed on the stars, often on the devil. Brother Owain watched these things unfold as he journeyed once beyond the abbey, sent by his prior, to deliver a bundle of texts to a nearby priory. On his way, he stopped at a local manor and was invited, nay commanded, to dine with the household. He observed in silence as a peacock, feathers reaffixed and painted, was carried in procession through the hall. The meat beneath was dry and gray, its flavor masked by a paste of ground almonds and sugar. It was beautiful, he noted, and nearly inedible. Later that night, curled in a straw mattress, he pondered what it meant to nourish the soul when the body was barely fed. Could beauty redeem rot? Could ritual disguise decay? These were not questions the rule of St. Benedict answered. They were the quiet riddles of survival. By the next morning, his host had taken ill. Some murmured of bad oysters. Others suspected a cursed relic, recently purchased from a traveling friar. Brother Owain, ever cautious, simply sipped his warm ale and departed in silence, clutching his scrolls close and his curiosity closer. And as the abbey's bell called him home, the winds carried with them the mingled scents of salt, ash, and something faintly sweet, perhaps apples, rotting gently in a cellar somewhere, waiting for mouths that had no better choice. In the days that followed Brother Owain's return to the abbey, the seasons began to shift with the slow reluctance of a world unsure of its next mood. Early autumn crept across the land with soft footsteps, brushing the hedgerows in pale gold and scenting the air with damp leaves and earth. It was a time of quiet preparation, of gathering the last green things before the frost came calling. And in the abbey, where the rhythm of life was measured by bells and prayer, the monks turned their minds and hands toward the harvest. Brother Owain, still haunted by the banquet he had witnessed, resumed his studies with a furrowed brow and a silent heart. He had tasted the illusions of nobility, the decorative plumage wrapped around putrescence, and found no joy in it. And so, he returned with fresh devotion to the herbarium, where simplicity still held power. But even here, he could not escape the deeper truth. Food, the very sustenance of life, was rarely a thing of comfort in this age. It was often a challenge, a gamble, sometimes a punishment. In the scriptorium, he copied texts that hinted at ancient wisdom. Galenic theory, humoral balance, the Greek classifications of hot and cold, dry and wet. Food was not eaten merely for pleasure, but for its effect on the body's inner weather. Leeks were hot and dry, best for those with melancholic humors. Fish, cold and wet, required balancing with mustard or vinegar. Apples, too cooling for the elderly, needed to be baked or stewed to avoid chilling the stomach. It was an intricate web of belief and practice, where nourishment meant navigating unseen forces. But these theories were not confined to the cloisters. Across the countryside, in farms and hamlets hidden by mist, these same beliefs shaped every meal, however meager. An old widow named Etheldreda, who lived alone near the woodland edge, brewed her soups not with recipes, but with instinct born of bitter seasons. She knew which roots to avoid when the moon was new, which herbs soothed a swollen belly, and how to dry wild mushrooms so they would not bring visions. Her food was plain, often bitter, but it healed more than it harmed. She told stories to the children who visited her in secret, tales of cursed berries and enchanted cabbages. She would smile with her few remaining teeth and whisper, "The plants know things, more than we do." Her broth was sometimes just nettles and salt, but none who drank it fell ill. Etheldreda had learned the hard way, by burying her husband after he ate the wrong mushrooms, by nursing her daughter through barley sickness caused by mold that flourished unseen. While the monks sought wisdom in parchment, Etheldreda found hers in the soil. But both paths led to the same conclusion. Food could betray, even when given with love. Back in the manor kitchens, far removed from cloister or cottage, the cooks battled rot with fire and spice. Meat arrived in ox-drawn carts, already buzzing with flies. The cook, a man named Thorn with a sharp tongue and sharper cleaver, knew a dozen ways to dress and disguise the truth of a haunch gone gray. He would soak it in wine, rub it with crushed garlic, skewer it over coals until it blackened on the outside. And still, sometimes it failed to deceive. One evening, a visiting knight vomited his supper in full view of the household. The next day, Thorn sent 2 boys to catch fresh trout from the stream, refusing to trust the meat stores until the wind turned cooler. He cursed the summer and prayed for frost, for only in cold did the food cease its rebellion. But winter brought its own tyrannies. In a small village nestled near the edge of a once sacred forest, the first frost came earlier than expected. The barley had not yet been milled, and the root cellar flooded after a storm. Food that was meant to last the season spoiled in silence. Potatoes turned to mush, onions sprouted white beards, cheese sweated and split. And so began the slow march into hunger. Not a famine yet, but its cousin, hunger with sharp elbows and hollow stares. Children were the first to grow quiet at supper, their bowls half empty and their cheeks flushed not with warmth, but with fever. The village healer, a young woman named Brita, did what she could. She boiled bones into broth until they dissolved into marrow. She soaked bread in goat's milk, added crushed mint to mask the sourness. But the supplies dwindled, and when a cow fell ill, they dared not eat its flesh, fearing the signs of rot in its eyes. Brita remembered her grandmother's stories of the old hunger, when people ate bark, then rats, then their own shame. She swore never to let it return. But when a merchant passed through, selling dried fish at impossible prices, she gave up her last silver ring for a sack of salted cod. That night, she soaked the fish for hours, but the stench lingered like a warning. Still, they ate. 2 days later, the merchant was gone, and 3 villagers were ill with cramping and fever. Brida sat beside them, pressing damp cloths to their brows, and whispered prayers she barely believed in. She was young, but the food had aged her, as it did everyone. And so, across all corners of the land, monastery, manor, village, and wild, the struggle continued. It was not only the fight to preserve food, but to preserve meaning, dignity, and hope in every bite. To find something nourishing in a world that seemed determined to sour. Brother Owain, gazing into the flame of his candle one night, considered the quiet tragedies hidden in every loaf of bread, every pot of stew. He wondered how much of human suffering had come from something as simple as a spoiled bean, a misjudged herb, a mold invisible in the dimness. He wrote these thoughts down, carefully, in the margin of a manuscript about medicinal tinctures. Not for others to read, perhaps, but because some truths are too heavy to carry in silence. Outside, the wind shifted again. The trees let go of their leaves in slow spirals, and the world braced for another long season of testing. Far to the north, where the winds carved through stone cottages like knives through soft bread, another kind of winter approached, a hunger not born solely from nature, but from the choices of men. The village of Ayswick, cradled between steep hills and a silted riverbed, had seen its share of misfortunes. Poor soil, early frosts, and a lord more interested in falconry than farming had left the villagers with little to store for the cold months. And so, their tables were set with scarcity long before the snow arrived. In the wooden longhouse at the village's edge, old Gilda kept the fire going with damp heather and splinters of birch. She had lived through 5 famines and could taste the 6th in the air. Her joints told her what the skies had not yet revealed, that snow would fall before the end of the month. She muttered to herself as she stirred a pot of gruel, oats too few, water too much, and a bitter note of wild sorrel that she hoped would pass for flavor. Her grandchildren, thin-limbed and hollow-eyed, huddled nearby, waiting for the scrape of the ladle. There was no meat left. No fat, no cheese, and barely a knob of butter, now more gray than gold. The last chicken had been stolen weeks ago, likely by the Reeves boy, whose family fared little better. And though the villagers whispered of trapping foxes or rats, Gilda remembered the last time such desperate measures had been taken. The stew had made her son bleed from his mouth and die with a rattle no prayer could soothe. Still, the hunger did not wait for safe options. One bitter evening, a traveling peddler arrived, dragging a cart laden with bundled sacks and reeking of old apples and ash. He claimed to have dried meats from the coast, mackerel perhaps, or salt pork, though none could tell beneath the layer of grime and brine. His prices were steep, and his eyes sharper than they should have been. He sold without care, pocketing what little coin or labor could be offered, and left before sunrise. Those who ate of his goods that night found themselves in agony by morning. Gilda, who had traded a carved spoon for a handful of dried something wrapped in linen, fed her share to the fire instead. The scent of it, once heated, reminded her of sickness, of something long buried and poorly remembered. The smoke drove her from the hearth and made the children cry. Such stories were not rare. Throughout the countryside, merchants with dubious wares traveled freely, preying on desperation. They sold meat of unknown origin, pies stuffed with more bone than flesh, and spices ground so fine that no one could tell what plant or creature they had come from. Some were merely cheats. Others brought poison with their promises. In the towns, the situation was little better, only veiled with the illusion of choice. Market stalls brimmed with turnips and cabbages, bruised apples, and withered garlic. But it was not freshness that determined value, only appearance. Rot could be scraped, maggots picked out, and a glaze of honey or ale could mask the staleness beneath. Bakers kneaded sawdust into their loaves to stretch the flour, and fishmongers soaked their wares in vinegar to preserve a blush of color. But beneath all this bustle, a quiet panic stirred. In the city of Lexington, nestled beside a freezing estuary, food riots had broken out the previous winter. The bishop's granaries had been stormed, and sacks of barley stolen by men with rags around their faces and nothing but hunger in their eyes. The bishop's men, armored and eager, had responded with blades. Blood stained the cobbled square, and yet it was not the dead who caused fear. It was the silence that followed. No one spoke of it. No justice was sought. The food remained locked away, guarded day and night. And so the citizens adapted. They boiled bones until they cracked and gave up their marrow. They ground acorns into bitter flour. They roasted chestnuts and called it a feast. Some, in their madness, turned to worse things. Rumors spread of a tanner's apprentice who disappeared, of a stew that tasted too rich for rabbit. In such times, knowledge became both blessing and curse. Apothecaries offered tinctures to ease the belly, but most were made from chalk, soot, and vinegar. Physicians advised fasting and prayer, sometimes prescribing leeches to balance the humors. But nothing could balance an empty stomach. Even the wealthy, hidden behind their heavy doors and thick curtains, began to notice their tables thinning. In one grand house on the hill, Lady Aldreda sat staring at a roast goose that no longer pleased her. She had tasted pepper, cinnamon, and rose water for years. They now seemed hollow, theatrical. She remembered being a girl eating boiled lentils in her mother's solar, watching the servants gnaw on bones. Those days had been lean, yes, but also clear. Now, with her silks and her spices, she felt as though she ate shadows. She sent the goose away untouched. Her steward, a man called Benrick, watched with a tight jaw. He knew the stores were running low. He knew the wine casks were more water than grape. And he knew that within the week, the servants would begin pilfering whatever they could find, not out of rebellion, but necessity. He had already hidden the cheese under the chapel floor and bribed a cook to water the porridge twice as much. It would not be enough. Back in Eswick, Gilda began preparing for the worst. She dried bark from the old apple tree and ground it into a powder. She roasted parsnip peels until they curled. She gathered stinging nettles despite the welts they left. And then, when the first snow fell, she told her grandchildren stories. Stories of a time when food had been plentiful, when fairs offered roasted boar and sweetmeats, when people fed each other not with fear but with joy. They listened, wide-eyed, the sound of their bellies echoing like small drums. Gilda did not weep. She knew her tears were too salty to waste. And far away, in the abbey, where Brother Owain now penned his thoughts by candlelight, a silence settled over the kitchen. The stores were leaner than they should have been. Even the monks, bound by their vows of simplicity, felt the coming cold with uneasy hearts. Yet in that silence somewhere, a seed of resistance stirred, not of rebellion, but of memory. The memory that food, even in its humblest form, was meant to bring people together, not isolate them. That a shared bowl, no matter how thin the broth, could be a sacred thing. But such memories, in that century, were hard to hold on to. In the cloistered garden of the abbey, frost now settled in fine lace along the edges of dying leaves. Brother Owain, wrapped in his threadbare mantle, moved slowly among the raised beds and barren trellises, his fingers trailing across the empty stalks. The mint had withered, the marjoram long harvested, and only a few stubborn heads of winter kale still clung to life. The garden had given all it could. Now came the season of enduring. Within the stone walls, the kitchen fires burned lower than usual. Wood was rationed carefully, and the morning porridge, once served warm and thick, had grown thin and lukewarm. Brother Hallett, the cook, did his best to stretch the stores. Dried beans reboiled for days, a turnip here and there softened in ale, stale bread soaked until it dissolved into paste. The monks gave no complaint, their vows bound them to humility. But even piety could not still the gnawing ache of undernourishment. Owain had taken to spending longer hours in the scriptorium, his candle flickering late into the night as he pored over old texts, not just herbals and medical treatises, but curious scraps from earlier centuries, Roman culinary fragments, Moorish recipes smuggled into Christendom, tales from pilgrims who had tasted saffron and sesame on distant roads. These he read not with hunger, but with longing, not just for the food itself, but for the sense of wonder it once inspired. He came across a passage, translated from the Greek, describing a dish of lentils with honey and crushed coriander. It struck him with unexpected force, so simple, yet impossibly distant from the broth they now consumed, flavored only with salt and prayer. The ancients, he realized, had not only eaten to live, but lived to savor. Where had that joy gone? The answer, he suspected, lay not in the food, but in the fear. For fear had crept into every corner of medieval life. Fear of spoilage, of famine, of disease. Fear of sin, of gluttony, of temptation. In this fear, food had been stripped of its music. What remained was necessity, a crude exchange between survival and decay. Beyond the abbey, the fear was more immediate. In the port town of Wymir, ships brought not bounty but sickness. Spoiled grain from across the sea was offloaded into warehouses that reeked of mildew. Merchants, desperate not to lose their investment, sold it at discount to bakers and brewers. The result was bread that crumbled before it could be sliced, beer that soured before it could be swallowed. The townsfolk muttered that God was punishing them for some hidden sin. The priests preached fasting, repentance, purification, but no sermon could sweeten the bread or cleanse the air. Children cried through the night from aching bellies, and the apothecaries ran out of ginger and clove, those rare, costly luxuries that soothed the gut and masked the foulness of rancid meat. One baker, a man named Tolan, began to bake with desperation. He mixed flour with ground beans and ash, shaping loaves that blackened quickly in the fire. He knew they were dangerous, dense, heavy, and hard as stone, but people bought them anyway. There was no choice. A wedge of such bread could fill the belly for hours, though it left the eater gasping with thirst and aching for days. Tolan himself ate none of it. He kept a small sack of oats hidden behind his oven, enough to make a private porridge in the early hours before dawn. He would sit in the warmth of the embers, spooning the bland mush into his mouth while the town still slept. It was not out of selfishness, but guilt. If he was to feed others poison, he could not allow himself the same fate. In the same town, an old fishwife named Berta began fermenting fish in wooden barrels, her hands cracked and bleeding from salt. The smell was unbearable to her neighbors, but she swore it preserved better than drying or smoking. She seasoned it with wild herbs, trying to disguise the rot, and sold it in waxed cloth to those with enough coin. The brave ate it with boiled onions. The rest avoided her stall entirely. Yet, as winter deepened, even Berta's barrels emptied. Back in the abbey, the monks turned to fasting more strictly. Their rule allowed for meat only in the infirmary, and even fish was now a rarity. The brethren took to boiling dried roots into thin soups, reciting psalms as the steam rose faintly from their wooden bowls. The ritual gave them comfort, but not strength. Brother Owain noticed that even the strongest among them began to stumble during matins, their fingers slow in turning pages, their voices cracking on the final verses. The infirmarian, Brother Giles, offered herbal cordials for weakness, but all knew they were made from dregs, leftover tinctures steeped in sour ale and old vinegar. Still, no one dared speak of despair. To do so was to question Providence. Yet Owain felt a sorrow settling over the abbey like dust, fine and constant, coating every breath with its quiet weight. And in that silence, he began to write. Not treatises, not recipes, but reflections. He called them Meditations on the Table. In them, he wrote of hunger not as punishment, but as memory. Of food not as necessity, but as communion. He wrote of Etheldreda's nettle broth, of Gilda's apple bark powder, of Brida's goat milk bread. He wrote of the monks and their silent grace, of the townsfolk and their courage in the face of rot. He wrote to remember. He wrote so that, one day when the world was fuller and the bread was sweet again, someone might look back and understand what it had cost to survive a meal. Outside, snow fell gently on the cloister walls. The world hushed beneath its weight. And in the abbey, a single candle burned late into the night, flickering beside the ink-stained hands of a monk who had chosen, above all else, to bear witness. In a distant dale, where the hills folded like old linen and mists clung low across the meadows, a manor named Brackenreach stood quiet and brooding. Its stone walls, moss-streaked and cracked from years of neglect, leaned wearily toward the earth, as though tired of holding in the ghosts of feasts long past. Once it had echoed with the clamor of lavish banquets, trumpets, goblets, dancers' feet upon the flagged floors, but now it stood hushed, its larders hollow, its kitchen hearth cooled to a whisper. Lady Iseldra, last of her line, moved through the halls like a wraith of former glories. She wore her dead mother's velvet gown, the hem stitched and restitched to fit her frame, and kept her thinning hair bound beneath a net of tarnished gold. Her eyes, once wide with delight at the sight of roasted capon or honeyed figs, now passed without interest over her steward's offerings. A bowl of peas shriveled and salted, a heel of rye bread blackened with age, and a pewter cup of wine so sour it puckered her lips. The winter had crept upon them too swiftly. Her tenants had fled or perished, her stores plundered by bandits during the last frost, and the kitchen maid had vanished one morning, leaving only a smear of jam on the sill and footprints in the snow that led toward the forest. Lady Iseldra suspected the girl had followed rumors of abundance elsewhere, as so many others had done, chasing whispers of towns where oranges glowed on platters and pies steamed fresh from ovens gilded with egg yolk and clove. But Lady Iseldra knew better. She had lived long enough to learn the weight of hunger's illusions. Her steward, Master Ingry, was a solemn man with deep-set eyes and a voice like creaking wood. He had served the household since boyhood and remembered the taste of spice cakes and roasted almonds in the days of her father's rule. Now, he spent his days turning meager scraps into nourishment and lies. He thickened stews with ash-colored barley and told tales of better days to the two remaining maids, who whispered prayers as they served her. One such day, a merchant came riding up the broken path to Brackenreach, a rare visitor. His cloak was trimmed with fur, but his horse was lean, and the cart behind him bore more promises than goods. He spoke quickly, eyes darting across the manor's shadowed windows. Dried figs, he claimed, ground nutmeg, even preserved lemons packed in brine. But when Ingry inspected the goods, he found the figs split with insects, the nutmeg dull and tasteless, and the lemons shriveled like old toes. Still, Lady Iseldra bid him stay for supper. They ate the last of the lentils that night, cooked with wilted greens, and an old bone boiled thrice before. The merchant complimented the meal, eyes flickering with forced charm, and offered her a vial of rosewater as a gift, to remind you, my lady, of warmer times. She accepted it with a quiet nod, and after he left, she poured the rosewater into the hearth. The scent rose sweet and strange against the wood smoke, and for a brief moment the hall felt less hollow. But by morning, the cold had returned, and with it, the quiet dread. Meanwhile, in a more crowded quarter of the world, far from Brackenreach's silence, the city of Darnlow struggled with its own rituals of decay. Here the markets were louder, the stew pots deeper, but the food no more trustworthy. Pies were sold by street hawkers with fillings too finely minced to identify. Alewives stirred vats with grim expressions, masking the taste of poor malt with burned sugar and bitter herbs. In the poorer alleys, families shared single radishes, raw and cold, dipped in brine to mimic a richer bite. Beggars traded secrets about bakeries that still used real butter, though often those tips led only to cracked teeth and disappointment. The city smelled of damp flour, soot, and the ever-present undercurrent of human desperation. In one corner of the city, a tinker named Jonan had begun selling what he called memory stew. It was made from root peelings, onion skins, and water darkened with burned bread. He served it from a dented cauldron and told every customer a story as they ate. Tales of roasted partridge, of mead warmed with cloves, of figs stuffed with walnuts. He claimed the stories made the stew taste richer, and to some, they did. But one day, a nobleman's son, slumming for amusement, mocked Jonan's efforts and upturned the pot. The stew splattered across the cobbles, and Jonan, kneeling to salvage what he could, whispered, "Even lies feed the heart when the belly is hollow." The next day, the son's household fell ill. Spoiled pork at a wedding feast, it was said. The irony was not lost on those who had once lined up for Jonan's tales. Back in the abbey, Brother Owain had begun gathering accounts. From letters, overheard confessions, and travelers' tales, he pieced together a tapestry of culinary suffering. He compiled them into a leather-bound codex, an unusual act, for the monastery had no tradition of cookery texts. But Owain's codex was not filled with recipes. It was filled with memories, of dishes long vanished, of methods both noble and crude, of the spiritual toll exacted by every spoiled loaf and every rancid broth. He titled it, The Bitter Table. The brothers regarded it with quiet respect. Some read its pages at night by candlelight. Others avoided it as one might avoid a mirror that shows too much. But still, the codex grew. New entries appeared, accounts from pilgrims, from reeves, from washerwomen and shepherds. Stories of dried carrot tea, of boiled leather, of barley cakes hardened like stone and broken with mallets before eating. Owain wrote it all. And in doing so, he realized that the suffering around food was not simply a matter of taste or lack. It was the place where all fear converged, fear of death, of shame, of emptiness. But it was also the place where defiance could spark. Even the poorest widow, with her last handful of lentils, could summon courage by the fire. The abbey bell tolled for vespers, echoing down the frozen fields. Owain placed his quill aside, stretched his aching fingers, and whispered a quiet blessing over the open codex. Outside, the cold deepened. But within the words, a kind of warmth remained. Snow lay thick across the countryside like a shroud of silence, blanketing the land and muffling the footsteps of those who still dared to move beneath the slate-gray sky. In villages, the world seemed paused. Fields frozen, rivers slowed, trees groaning softly under their icy burdens. And yet, within every cottage and hall, life continued in its quiet, persistent fashion, shaped entirely by what the people could coax from their dwindling stores and their unyielding will. In the village of Netherfen, a small cluster of thatched homes hidden deep in the valley, the hearth was both sanctuary and stage. There, in a longhouse shared by 3 families, meals were performed like rituals, as much about memory as sustenance. They gathered each evening as the dusk crept in, parents, children, elders, spooning gruel from a single blackened pot, passing torn bits of bread like sacred offerings. There was no butter, no salt, no flesh. The porridge was made of cracked rye, sometimes enriched with dried turnip peels, and on rare occasions, a pinch of lard. One of the older men, Aldwin the charcoal burner, told stories as they ate. He had once traveled to distant towns where merchants served goose fat on barley cakes, and he spun tales of pies filled with cherries and meats minced so fine they melted in the mouth. The children listened with rapt attention, licking their wooden spoons and imagining the banquet behind their closed eyes. Yet even Aldwin, for all his optimism, could not ignore the creeping signs of scarcity. The cellar held only a few sacks of oats and beans, and the last cabbage had withered in the smoke before it could be saved. Rats had grown bold, and dogs disappeared quietly in the night. There were rumors of a woman in the next village who'd boiled leather boots for broth. In the face of hunger, nothing was too strange to consider. In the days that followed, a new fear began to whisper along the hedgerows: sickness. It came softly at first, with shivers and sudden weariness. Then came the bloating, the strange blotches on skin, the retching of food that had seemed harmless only a day before. In Netherfen, 2 children fell ill after eating wild mushrooms gathered in desperation. One recovered, though never quite whole. The other was buried beneath a cairn of frost-covered stones. The villagers blamed the weather, the devil, the unseen sins of the world. But Aldwin, old and watchful, said nothing. He remembered the year of the black bread, when fungus grew on the rye and took men's minds, made them scream of fire within their blood. He had seen it once, decades ago, and he feared its return more than death itself. Far to the east, across snow-blanketed moors and creaking forests, another household fought its own battle with the season. In a crumbling stone estate near the edge of a forgotten barony, a knight named Sir Cedric maintained a small retinue, though he had long ceased to play the part of lord. His table was sparse: cracked bowls, tarnished silver, and a fire that barely warmed the hall. Sir Cedric had once fought in foreign wars and returned with stories of lamb stewed in wine, of pomegranates and salted almonds, of bread so light it crumbled in the hand. Now his cook prepared meals with dried beans and a wheel of cheese grown so hard it needed a hammer to break. Still, Cedric held fast to one tradition. Every meal, no matter how meager, began with a blessing and a toast, offered in silence to the portraits that lined the wall. His ancestors, long dead and likely more well-fed in their graves than he now was in life. His steward, a one-eyed man named Harl, brought news of neighboring lands. Villages burned by bandits, granaries locked by bishops, a merchant caravan turned back at the pass by snow and wolves. Cedric listened, nodded, and said only, "Keep the chickens hidden. Even the poor have knives." He meant no cruelty. He merely understood the truth of hunger. It made people brave or cruel or both. Meanwhile, back at the Abbey, Brother Owain stood at the window of the scriptorium, watching snow fall in slow spirals past the leaded glass. The candle beside him guttered with each cold draught, and the ink in his well had grown sluggish, thick with the chill. Yet still he wrote. His codex, the bitter table, had grown to include accounts from distant abbeys, from wayward pilgrims, even from a blind beggar who claimed to have eaten roasted crow seasoned with sage. Owain no longer wrote with sorrow alone. He had begun to write with purpose, with the quiet determination of a man who saw, through the veil of suffering, the resilience it hid. He chronicled not only what was lost, but what was created. New dishes born of poverty, clever substitutions, strange experiments that had become tradition. He wrote of moss boiled with milk, of eggs pickled in brine, of bread baked on flat stones over hearth coals. He understood now that cuisine was not only the realm of wealth, it was the child of desperation. And in that desperation, beauty sometimes bloomed. The monks had begun to read his work aloud during the evening meals, not for instruction, but for reflection. One passage described a woman who had kept her family alive for 3 winters on nothing but dried beans, onions, and the laughter she forced herself to perform each night. It brought tears to one of the younger brothers, who quietly wiped his face with his sleeve. That night, Owain sat by the cold ashes of the hearth and stared into the darkness, seeing not only famine and spoilage, but something else, something quieter and harder to name. Perhaps it was dignity, or perhaps it was the stubborn spark of endurance that flickered even in the heart of starvation. He dipped his quill and wrote one last line before sleep. "It is not what we eat, but how we bear it, that determines the soul's feast." Then he closed the codex, wrapped himself in a woolen robe, and whispered a prayer not for more food, but for the strength to meet whatever form it next arrived in. In the heart of a forest, known to few maps and fewer roads, the village of Clyden Hollow huddled like a secret pressed between the trees. Its people were a quiet folk, bound by old customs and a reverence for the land that bordered on superstition. They spoke little of the outside world, and the world, in turn, forgot them. Yet, even in such seclusion, the lean hunger of the age found its way through the frost-bitten woods and into their doorways. Clyden Hollow survived not by bounty, but by balance. Each family kept bees, dug roots, and dried mushrooms beneath the eaves. In spring, they tapped birch trees for sap. In autumn, they traded wool for barley with passing monks. But by winter, they turned inward, relying on what they had put away in silence and hope. There were no grand meals here, only small victories. A handful of chestnuts, a spoonful of honey, a slab of smoked trout. Old Mirwin, the village matron, remembered when winters were easier. She would sit by the fire, combing her long white hair, and speak softly to the children about a time when bread rose like clouds and the butter churned golden and thick. Her voice would grow thin when she recalled the way meat once sang on the spit, crackling with fat. But the children had never known such things. To them, a sweet apple was as rare as a comet. This winter, the cold came early, and the stores proved inadequate. The smoked meats were leaner than hoped, the beans riddled with weevils, and the salt barrel half empty. A sickness began to stir among the young. Bloated bellies, sunken eyes, coughs that rattled deep in the chest. The villagers gathered in the chapel, not to pray for plenty, but to pray for endurance. Mirwin, though frail, began to cook a stew every evening from whatever could be spared. She called it her blessing broth, a mixture of parsnips, dried herbs, and crumbled oatcakes, sometimes flavored with pine needles or crushed acorns. She served it in wooden bowls carved by her father's father, each one bearing the family's mark. "Eat," she would whisper. "Let it not be feast nor famine, but enough." One night, as snow fell in thick silence outside, a stranger arrived at Clyden Hollow. Cloaked and hooded, with a staff worn smooth by years of walking, he asked for nothing but shelter from the storm. The villagers were wary, for strangers rarely brought anything but stories, and stories could be dangerous. Still, Mirwin took him in, offering him the last bowl of her blessing broth. He ate slowly, thoughtfully, as though tasting something sacred. Then he asked her what it was. She listed the ingredients: humble, poor, half-foraged, and quarter-dried. He smiled and nodded. "And yet," he said, "it warms better than goose and settles better than wine." The man stayed 3 nights, and on the morning he left behind a small leather pouch filled with dried orange peel, star anise, and a pinch of saffron. Mirwin had not seen saffron in 50 years. She did not ask where it came from. She only wept a little when she added it to the next evening's broth, and the smell filled the chapel with something that stirred even the sick to sit upright and breathe more deeply. Far from Clyden Hollow, the world spun onward, indifferent to such small moments of grace. In the great cities, the hunger turned more desperate. Riots erupted in markets where spoiled meat was sold as fresh. Bakers were imprisoned for hoarding. Priests were stoned for suggesting that fasting would bring divine relief. No one believed in fasts anymore. They believed only in the scrape of spoons at the bottom of empty pots. In the royal courts, meanwhile, the wealthy still dined, but their meals were now symbols, not sustenance. Feasts were orchestrated more for appearance than appetite. Peacocks roasted whole with feathers reaffixed. Pies filled with live songbirds that flew out upon cutting. Fountains of wine that flowed through golden channels. But the truth was whispered behind embroidered sleeves. Even the spices had grown stale. The meat was often second pick, the bread dry by midday. The illusion held, but barely. One courtier, Lady Tamsin of Belharrow, wrote secretly to her sister, "We eat to pretend, not to feed. I have not known true satisfaction in 5 winters. The plates are full, and still we starve." She had taken to sipping broth made by her lady's maid, a simple affair of onion, cabbage, and bone. It reminded her of childhood, of truth. Back in the Abbey, Brother Owain received a package by messenger. It was wrapped in oilskin and tied with wool cord. Inside, he found a bundle of linen pages, notes, recipes, stories written in many hands. Some were careful and learned. Others were clumsy, with spelling wild and margins smudged. They had been gathered from abbeys, manors, and hovels. They were bound not by ink, but by hunger. Owain read them slowly by firelight. There were tales of children eating rose hips from roadside thickets, of fathers trapping frogs in thawed streams, of mothers roasting marrow bones and telling their families it was beef. There were stories of laughter forced, of joy found in the simplest things: salt, heat, a crust of bread. He added them to the bitter table, one by one, with reverence. And that night, as the bells called the brothers to prayer, he looked out at the snow and felt, for the first time, that he was not merely a chronicler of suffering, but of survival. The food was still bitter, but the people somehow remained sweet. In a valley carved by forgotten rivers and watched over by hills thick with bramble and frost-silvered pines, the village of Norwith lay half buried in snow. Its cottages leaned together as if for warmth, their chimneys trailing thin ribbons of smoke into the dusk. Winter had turned harsh, and with it came a silence that pressed down upon the earth like wool upon shoulders too weary to carry it. The villagers did not speak much now, conserving their words the way they did their food, carefully, sparingly, never wastefully. Each morning brought the ritual of checking the root cellars, the barrels, the sacks in the loft. Each evening brought the quiet reckoning. How many turnips remained? How long the dried peas might stretch? Whether the last wheel of hard cheese could hold out until thaw. In the home of Widow Elred, the hearth fire was fed with splinters scavenged from a fallen gate. Her son, Halric, sat beside her, his hands too thin for his age, his voice quieter than it had been the year before. They had not seen meat in weeks. Their bread was more bran than flour, and the broth they drank each night was thick with shadows rather than substance. Yet Elred, with her wrinkled hands and her stubborn grace, had learned how to coax comfort from almost nothing. She sliced onions paper thin, stewed them slowly until their sweetness rose, and mixed them with stale ale and crumbled oatcakes. She called it market stew, and told Halric tales of feasts from the days when fairs brought spices and sweetmeats to the valley. Halric listened as if to a dream. He had never tasted pepper. He had never known the scent of cinnamon or the softness of a buttered roll. His world had always been sharp and plain, like nettles and cold air. But his mother's stories filled his mind with flavors he could only imagine. Meats glistening with fat, pies whose crusts flaked like frost, cheeses as soft as clouds. And in that imagining, he found a warmth that the hearth could not offer. Elsewhere in Norwith, the hunger sharpened its teeth. The village reeve, a thin man named Marlin, had begun taking count of who had what. His ledger was small and stained, but he kept it like scripture. Each family's name was listed beneath tallies of beans, roots, and dried goods. Those who had more were encouraged to share. Those with less were expected to make do. There were whispers that Marlin took more than he recorded, that his cellar was deeper than his mercy. But no one dared challenge him. Not openly. A carpenter's wife, Betha, whose children coughed through the night, began boiling lichen and moss to stretch their porridge. She bartered a wool shawl for a scrap of suet and rendered it with parsnips so soft they collapsed into water. It was a poor meal, but her youngest smiled afterward, which felt like a victory. One night, the village was visited by an old traveler, hunched with age, bearing a bundle wrapped in lambskin. He said little, only that he came from the north and asked only for a place by the fire. Widow Elred offered him her hearth, and in return, he gave her 3 cloves of garlic and a story. He spoke of a monastery far beyond the riverlands, where the brothers had built a glass house with thick panes and a fire-heated floor. There, even in winter, green things still grew, parsley, mint, and chard that reached toward the light like saints toward heaven. He said they shared what they could with the poor, and had developed a method of drying fruit with warmth and smoke that kept it good for months. Halric listened, wide-eyed. Garlic, mint, fruit. These were not just flavors, but ideas, possibilities, relics of a world that might still exist somewhere beyond the snow. When the traveler left, Elred tucked the garlic cloves into a pouch lined with wool. "We'll save them," she said, "for when it truly matters," rang on. And still, back at the abbey, Brother Owain worked by candlelight. His hands were sore, the ink in his pot thick as syrup, but his will was unshaken. The bitter table had grown fat with entries, accounts from all over the land, brought by pilgrims, scribes, and monks returning from errands among the sick and starving. He had received a new scroll only days before, sent from a friar in the south. It spoke of a convent where the sisters had grown marrows in barrels, and dried apple rings were shared with the dying as if they were relics of holy saints. He copied the account carefully, noting the way the sisters blessed each pot before stirring, as if to ward away not just spoilage, but despair. And despair, he knew, was the truest poison in times of hunger. Yet still, in every tale, there was resistance. Not rebellion with swords, but resistance through care. A child kept alive by laughter and broth, a neighbor who split his last heel of bread, a woman who shared the last of her lard to bake a feast for a wedding that had nothing but tears. Owain paused and looked around the scriptorium. The snow outside glowed faintly blue in the moonlight. In the distance, the abbey bell tolled Compline. He closed his codex and whispered aloud the words he had written only hours earlier. In the age of bitter bread, the kindness of hands was the finest meal of all. Then he rose, wrapped himself in his mantle, and walked into the chapel, where candles burned low but steady, like hope, like hunger, but gentler. In the dim corridors of the abbey, dawn crept like a pale spirit, hesitant and thin. The monks stirred from their beds wrapped in wool, their steps slow upon the cold stone floors. In the refectory, the morning meal was little more than a whisper of sustenance, a shallow bowl of barley water, and a heel of bread, harder than the bench upon which they sat. Yet even this was received with bowed heads and silent thanks. For in this bitter winter, even meager offerings held the weight of miracles. Brother Owain ate slowly, each mouthful a ritual more than a repast. His thoughts, as ever, wandered beyond the walls, past the garden gates now choked in frost, past the distant moors, past the frozen roads that once carried merchants with honey and dates. He thought of the villagers in the tales he had gathered. He thought of Merowyn and her blessing broth, of Lady Iseldra with her ruined feasts, of Gilda watching apples rot in silence. Each soul a thread in the tapestry of this long, bleak season. After the meal, he returned to the scriptorium, where his codex now rested with the reverence of scripture. The brothers had begun referring to it in hushed tones. They read from it before evening meals, selected passages that lifted not the body but the spirit. It had become a kind of prayer, one woven not from doctrine, but from survival and memory. Today, Owain added another entry. It was a letter dictated by a young novice named Benedictus, who had returned from tending the poor in a distant parish. Benedictus had spent a fortnight among villagers who had devised a method of preserving food in clay pots buried deep in frozen earth. They packed beetroot, swedes, and even sour apples with layers of straw and charcoal ash, sealing them from the damp. It was primitive, but effective. When he had tasted one of the apples, softened and pale, it had reminded him of joy. Owain smiled faintly at the thought, a joy from beneath the soil, a sweetness hidden in dark places. That afternoon, snow began to fall once more, thick and unrelenting. The abbey's bell tower disappeared behind a veil of white, and the sound of the world grew muffled, almost reverent. Fires were stoked with greater urgency, and the infirmary filled with the weak and coughing. Brother Giles passed among them with gentleness, pressing warm flannel to fevered brows, offering sips of warm beer steeped with chamomile and wild thyme. In one of the cells, a young boy lay shivering. He had been taken in from the village 3 days prior, orphaned, thin as bone, with eyes too large for his face. He spoke little, but clutched a strip of dried turnip wrapped in linen, a gift from his sister who had died on the road. He refused to eat anything else, guarding it like a relic. When Owain visited him, he sat in silence beside the bed and began to speak, not of medicine, but of stories. He told the boy about a monastery in the south that made stew from nettles and rose hips, sweetened with a touch of crabapple vinegar. He told him about a farmer who once fed an entire village with cakes made of flour, snow, and boiled thistle root. Slowly, the boy began to listen, then smile, then sleep. That night, the brothers gathered in the chapel, their breath rising like incense in the cold air. Owain was asked to read once more from the bitter table. He chose a passage about a fisherwoman named Serla, who had once dried fish over cedar branches, wrapping them in wool to preserve the flavor. She shared them with her neighbors during the famine of '94, and though they stank, they kept the village alive. When he finished, the silence lingered, not mournful, but meditative. The kind of silence one only finds among people who have known want and chosen to endure. And in the hush, Brother Martin, the eldest among them, spoke softly, "These stories are not of food alone. They are of grace." Owain nodded, but said nothing. He knew that to name such things aloud was to diminish them. Some truths were meant only to be lived and remembered. The next day, a messenger arrived, braving snow and sleet to bring a parcel from a distant priory. Inside were pages, more accounts, more fragments of endurance. A woman who preserved cabbage in honey and vinegar, a shepherd who baked bread upon hot stones under his coat, a blind nun who stirred broth by touch alone. Owain took up his quill once more, and as the snow pressed heavier upon the earth, as the cold clawed deeper into the bones of Christendom, his ink flowed warm and steady. He knew now what he was creating. It was not a history of food, nor a treatise on suffering. It was a testament to all who had stood before an empty bowl and dared to fill it with dignity. In the waning days of winter, when the wind lost some of its bite and the light lingered a little longer on the abbey walls, a strange stillness fell upon the land. It was not the peace of warmth, nor the promise of spring, but rather the deep pause before change. The monks moved through their days with slower steps, their shadows long and silent in the corridors. Even the crows atop the bell tower called less frequently, as if their voices too were weary from the long season of want. Brother Owain sat once more in the scriptorium, the codex of the bitter table laid open before him. The pages had thickened with the months, now dense with ink and time. Stories pressed close together like bodies in the cold, every line carrying the weight of hunger and the stubborn defiance that rose to meet it. As his quill danced across the parchment, he did not write from imagination or embellishment, but from reverence. For the lives documented therein had not merely survived, they had endured with grace. He turned to a new page and began to copy a recent account sent from a coastal priory, a small fishing hamlet battered by storms, its boats crushed upon the rocks. The villagers had turned to seaweed and gulls' eggs, digging through the sand at low tide for shellfish and crabs barely larger than a coin. One widow, Alessa by name, had learned to ferment sea kelp with cider vinegar, adding chopped sorrel to disguise the bitterness. Her concoction sustained half the village through a fortnight of storm and silence. It was, the letter said, like eating the ocean's sorrow, but better than death. Owain paused as he wrote that line. It was not a phrase one would find in scripture or song, yet it rang with the truest music of survival. Beyond the abbey, small changes began to stir. In the village of Holtwake, a blacksmith named Darren unearthed a crock of buried carrots, still firm and orange beneath their layer of straw and soil. He brought them to the chapel as an offering. The priest, astonished by the brightness of the color in a world so gray, blessed them aloud, and they were shared in slices thinner than wafers, passed from hand to hand like relics. Elsewhere, a midwife in Bramley Down discovered that the roots she'd dried in autumn, burdock, dandelion, and a last surviving clove of garlic, could still be brewed into a tonic that lifted fevers and stirred the appetite. She carried her brew from cottage to cottage, a wooden ladle sloshing gently at her side. Children followed her, giggling behind scarves, calling her Mother Bitter, though never unkindly. And in the manor of Evermere, where frost had crept beneath the tapestries and curled the edges of even the Lord's bed covers, the kitchen hearth roared anew. The cook, an aging man with hands like stone, had roasted the last duck weeks before. Yet he found, in the back of the larder, a jar of dried mushrooms sealed with wax. He stewed them in barley and lard, and the scent filled the hall with something close to nostalgia. Lord Evermere declared it the finest meal of the year, though it was humble and brown as mud. These moments, small, flickering, almost nothing, reached Owain in letters, spoken reports, and whispered confessions. Each one he folded gently into the codex, each one he believed a sacred act. In time, Brother Giles approached him, eyes rimmed with weariness, a scroll in hand. "It is from the bishop's house," he said, voice low. "They have heard of your writings." Owain unrolled the parchment and read. The message was formal, the Latin crisp and unquestioning. The bishop requested a copy of the codex. He had heard through channels both holy and common that within the abbey was a book unlike any other. A chronicle not of kings or battles, but of the foodless, the forgotten, the faithful. Owain did not hesitate. He gathered his notes, bound a copy by hand, and wrapped it in cloth as carefully as one might swaddle a child. It was carried south with prayers and with fear, for he knew that not all who read the truth welcomed it. Yet the abbey remained quiet, undisturbed. And in the days that followed, a curious thing occurred. Letters began arriving from unexpected places. A knight in exile, recounting how he once baked rye in his armor, using the sun's heat to cook a crust. A washerwoman from the marshes, who caught eels with her hands and stewed them with herbs growing wild between tombstones. A child's drawing sent from a convent, showing a turnip carved into the shape of a lamb. Owain read each, transcribed them, and added them to the ever-growing codex. He understood now that the bitter table was no longer his alone. It had become a vessel, passed from soul to soul, carrying not just recipes, but remembrance. Not just scarcity, but sanctity. That evening, as the monks gathered for supper, still bread, still broth, still the same quiet hunger, they asked Owain to read once more. He opened to a passage newly written, and his voice filled the refectory like the soft tolling of a bell. When the world grew cold and the cupboards bare, the people did not vanish. They grew inventive, they grew kind, they grew fierce with hope. And from the ashes of their kitchens, they made something that even kings could not command, a meal worth remembering. He closed the book. The silence that followed was not of want, but of reverence. And outside, though the wind still blew and snow lingered on the eaves, something softer moved through the trees. A thaw, a change, a hint of earth beneath the frost. Spring was not yet come, But it was coming. It was in the waning breath of winter that the first true sign of spring stirred, not loudly, not with trumpets or sudden thaw, but with the faintest tremor beneath the soil. Brother Owain was in the garden, alone beneath a sky the color of pewter, his breath coiling in front of him like incense. He had taken it upon himself to inspect the raised beds, though none expected any yield. Snow had melted, leaving behind earth soggy and sour, the beds scattered with the withered ghosts of autumn's greens. Still, he turned the soil gently with his hands, hoping without reason. And there it was, under a bed of frost-bitten kale, tucked beneath crumbled straw and the crinkled leaves of long-dead marjoram, his fingers struck something solid. He brushed the soil away to reveal a pale root, its skin golden and waxy. A forgotten parsnip. He held it up like a relic, feeling the weight of it in his palm. It was not large, nor was it unblemished, but it was real. It was living, and it was enough. Brother Owain knelt in silence, as though in prayer, and slowly unearthed more. 3 parsnips, a small cluster of overwintered carrots, and 2 bulbs of spring garlic just beginning to split the earth with green. He brought them into the abbey, wrapped in his cloak, and laid them upon the wooden preparation table in the kitchen. Brother Hallett, the cook, gasped aloud, his hand trembling as he reached for the first parsnip. That evening, the refectory held a meal unlike any they had known all winter. No meat graced the table, no spices adorned the dish, but the broth simmered rich with root vegetables, flecked with parsley salvaged from the greenhouse, and seasoned with salt, humility, and hope. The brothers gathered around their bowls with reverence. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, the silence broken only by the gentle clink of spoons against wood and the soft hum of gratitude. And then, without fanfare, someone laughed. It was a small, startled sound, half chuckle, half sigh, but it bloomed through the room like spring itself. A moment later, Brother Cillian told a tale of the time he'd mistaken wild horseradish for ginger and wept for a full hour over his lentil gruel. The table burst into muffled laughter, voices hushed not from sorrow, but from disbelief that such sound could still live within them. Owain did not speak, only listened, his hands warm around his bowl, the scent of parsnips and broth rising like prayer. The days that followed bore subtle changes. The sun lingered longer on the cloister walls. Birds returned to the garden, pecking at thawed earth. Snow receded inch by inch, revealing sprigs of nettle and sorrel clinging to the garden edges. Brother Giles brewed a tonic from dried mint and garlic skins, and it was served with morning bread thinner than ever, but still bread nonetheless. Then came the villagers. From the valley below, carts rolled cautiously up the abbey road, oxen with ribs like barrel hoops, wheels creaking from frost thaw. The people brought offerings not in abundance, but in faith. Turnips, leeks, wild onions, and jars of preserved eggs sealed with beeswax. A blacksmith's wife brought a pot of pea mash mixed with barley. A child handed over a bundle of dried nettle leaves tied with string. They came not to beg but to give, and with each gift, they shared their stories. A miller's daughter told of how she had used the flour dust swept from the cracks of her father's storeroom to make flatbread on a heated slate. A shepherd told of boiling grass roots and scraping lichen from trees to feed his flock and himself. A weaver's wife described steeping sour milk in boiled herbs to calm her sick husband's belly, and how he called it meadow cream. Owain welcomed each guest not as scribe but as brother. He recorded every tale, copied each method into the bitter table. The codex had grown thick now, its vellum pages swollen with ink, wear, and weight. Yet still it was not done. Letters began arriving from farther afield. Abbots, reeves, midwives, washerwomen. Some were scribbled in charcoal on the back of tithe records, others in careful script on scraps of cloth. Tales of food not fit for kings, but fit for survival. Soup made from fish bones, crushed into paste, bread baked atop fire-warmed stones, dried roots steeped in sour ale to mimic meat. Owain transcribed them all. One day, Prior Eamon came to him in the scriptorium. In his hands, he carried a letter, a summons from the bishop's house. They had heard of the codex and requested a copy. Owain said nothing. He wrapped a copy in wool, sealed it with wax, and sent it on its way. Whether it would be read with reverence or scorn, he did not know. But the truth would reach them. That evening, in the soft amber of candlelight, the monks asked Owain to read aloud once more. But this time, It was the prior who rose instead. He opened the bitter table and began. They endured not on bread alone, but on the breaking and sharing of it. On bitter roots, they built kindness. On spoiled broth, they stirred hope. And where the tongue found no sweetness, the soul found the memory of it. The room was still when he finished, the fire low but warm, and in that stillness, as frost clung to the last shadows beyond the cloister, Brother Owain stepped into the garden once more. Beneath the cold moon, he pressed his fingers to the thawing soil. It was soft, living, waiting. The hunger had not vanished. The bitterness still lingered in their memories. But something deeper had taken root, a kind of grace, a remembering, a reverence for what it meant to eat, to share, to survive. And somewhere beyond the garden wall, in the hills still white with snow, spring was beginning its slow, holy march.